Okay, dann sehe ich, die ersten finden ihre Plätze wieder vom Kaffee trinken. Ich freue mich, den Daniel anmoderieren zu können. Daniel kommt aus Stuttgart, hat in Stuttgart zumindest promoviert und wird uns einen RFC-Draft vorstellen, beziehungsweise die Quintessenz aus dem RFC-Draft. Und weil wir alle wissen, wie anstrengend es ist, RFCs zu lesen, das ist natürlich viel schöner, einen Speaker hier zu haben, der einem das verständlich erklären kann. Der Talk ist auch schon auf der Lokomokosec in Hawaii gehalten worden. Das heißt, er kommt jetzt von Hawaii nach Karlsruhe quasi zu euch. Ich freue mich. Einmal Applaus für den Daniel.
Ja, vielen Dank. Hat hier irgendjemand Bauchschmerzen damit, wenn wir den Talk auf Englisch machen? Ich bin das nämlich irgendwie auf Englisch gewohnt. Ich sehe keine Handzeichen. Gut. The security upgrade for OAuth 2.0, or how not to use OAuth. Who has seen, I think in the last week or so, this attack on Microsoft Azure services and other Microsoft services? So it was in the media, and was another OAuth vulnerability in a big OAuth deployment. And the idea is that we at some point, or that we at some time come to a point where such attacks cannot occur any longer. So who here in the room is familiar with OAuth? That's quite a lot. That's good. Okay, so quick recap. What is OAuth? As a user, you've probably seen OAuth. Maybe when you do a login with Facebook, when you use login with Google as well, or if you Apple ID is also based on OAuth and OpenID Connect, and nowadays OAuth is also used in banking applications. I will have a word about that in a moment. OAuth is a standard for federated authorization. What does that mean? Well, authorization is when a user authorizes a so-called client to access her data at some other server. So for example, if you authorize a photo editor app to access your photos at your Google Photos account, that's authorization. So you give access to the client to your data. And then there's also authentication. Those two, it's sometimes hard to differentiate between these two. Authentication if a user authenticates to a so-called relying party using her identity from an identity provider. For example, if a user authenticates to Airbnb using her Facebook account. That's authentication. OAuth is a standard for federated authorization, not for authentication. And this is really important to make the distinction here. If you do authorization, use OAuth. If you want to do user authentication, you can use OAuth, but you also have to stack on top of OAuth OpenID Connect. In this talk, we'll speak about OAuth, but most of the things that we see here are as well applicable to OpenID Connect because it is based on OAuth. Okay, so how does OAuth work? To get everybody on the same page, let's have a look at the authorization code grant. So there are 4 different grant types in OAuth. One of them is the authorization code grant, and that works as follows. The user wants to give the photo editor app access to her Google Photos account, and to that end, she says, okay, I'd like to connect that client with Google Photos, and the client will redirect the user's browser to the authorization server. That's a server at Google. And in that authorization request, there are several pieces of data. For example, there is a redirect URI. That is the URI where the client expects the data from the AS to be received. And there's a state, which is important for cross-site request forgery protection. Now, the user's being asked in her browser, do you want to give access to your photos to this photo editor app? And then maybe she has to log in if she hasn't logged in before. And then she also authorizes the access. After that, the user's being redirected to that redirect URI. So that is the same URI here. The user's browser is being redirected to client.example/authok with a so-called authorization code. That's the foo42 in this. And there's also the state. That's just a copy from the same values in the authorization request. So there's an authorization code. Now, the client receives that authorization code through the user's browser. And now the client can redeem that authorization code for an access token at the so-called token endpoint at the authorization server. And the access token is the single most important thing in OAuth. That is what gives the client access to the data at Google Photos. So the access token is really the thing the client needs to do anything after this OAuth flow. So the client can now use that access token. There are several checks hidden here that you have to do in order to ensure that all of this is secure. Some of them are, for example, a check of the redirect URI. You want to ensure that the authorization code in the authorization response is never sent to, say, attacker.com, but it's only sent to that client. So we have to check the redirect URI at the authorization server that is legitimate. Usually that is pre-registered by that client at the authorization server. There's another check, and that is state for cross-site request forgery protection. So the client invents some state at the beginning of the flow, puts it in the authorization request. That is being sent to the authorization server, which reflects that value back to the client. So it puts it in the authorization response, and that is being sent back to the client. So the client can check, is the state value that I received together with the authorization code the same one that I came up with at the beginning of the flow? And if that is the case, we can assume that that code also comes from a legitimate authorization server and not from an attacker that tries to inject that code into the flow and have the user logged in where the user doesn't want to be logged in. So the client must check that the state parameter is equal. And then there's another optional check at the token endpoint. The authorization server, in this case speaking directly to the client, can demand a client authentication from the client. So the client has to provide, for example, username and password. There are also more advanced methods like presenting a certain certificate. So the client might have to authenticate to the authorization server to ensure that only the correct client can redeem that authorization code for an access token. So if somebody steals the authorization code, the idea is that he cannot be that he cannot redeem that authorization code. Okay, so that is the authorization code grant, and there's also another one which is very popular, the implicit grant. It's also sometimes called the simpler OAuth, and admittedly it is simpler, but it's also more insecure. How does that work? Well, the first steps are just the same. So you go to the client redirects you to the authorization server, but then something different happens. Again, there's an authorization response that is sent to the redirect URI. But this time, there's an access token. So not an authorization code, but an access token attached to that URI in the fragment part immediately. So there's no authorization code in this grant type, in this flow. Instead, the access token is being sent to the user's browser, where it can then be used, for example, by a single-page application, which has direct access to the contents of the URI. So the single-page application can just use the access token to access your photos. Or the single-page application, if it does have a backend or if it's not a single-page application, can, of course, also send the access token back to the client, where the client can then use that access token at the authorization server just as before. So this is the implicit grant. It is simpler, no authorization code, but we'll see in a moment why it's also insecure. OAuth was defined in RFC 6749, and that was 7 years ago. Today, we see a lot of security challenges for that protocol, and I'd like to present some of the challenges that we see in practice. Challenge number one are implementation flaws. we still see many of the implementation flaws that we also saw 7 years ago. For example, there are many anti-patterns that you really shouldn't use when using OAuth that we still see in practice. The redirect URI that I talked about is often not checked properly, so that attackers can get the authorization code or even the access token when the redirect URI is not properly checked by the authorization server. And that is exactly what happened in the attack on Microsoft. There was a whitelist of redirect URIs, and an attacker was able to register some of the URIs on that whitelist, which then led to the possibility of receiving the access token. Or the state parameter against CSRF protections. Oftentimes, it's not properly checked. People don't put fresh random numbers in there, but instead some static strings. And then obviously, all the protection is gone. There's a lot of research on that topic as well. And in some of the research works, they found that more than half of the clients don't implement OAuth correctly or securely. And if you look at popular libraries for OAuth, and if you read through the tutorials on how to use them, oftentimes all the security checks are just skipped. So developers who don't know about the security checks don't even have a chance to learn about them, that they are necessary. So challenge number 1 is that we see a lot of implementation flaws. Some of them are not, or were not really anticipated. Sometimes the technology underlying the web changes. For example, there was a change in how browsers treat URI fragments on browser redirections. And that could be exploited in a specific way when there was also an open redirector to get access or to send the access token to an attacker. So sometimes technology changes, and this causes then implementation flaws. So it's not always the developer's fault or the library developer's fault. Challenge number 2 is that OAuth was anticipated to be used for things like login with Facebook. Nowadays, we see OAuth used in environments that have much higher stakes. For example, in open banking environments. So you can access, so you probably know about the PSD2 regulation. We have something like 6,000 banks in Europe, and all of them are forced to implement open interfaces to the bank accounts, to the account information, to the list of transactions, and so on. They came up with standards to do that, of course. For example, the Berlin Group standard, or STAT in France, or the Open Banking Standard in the UK. And all of them are based on OAuth for authentication and authorization. So that's super interesting. Nowadays, we have OAuth in really high-stakes environment. We even have it in things like e-government. We have it in things like qualified electronic signatures. That's also what we are doing at my company. So we have environments where you really can't tolerate the kind of security flaws that we see in OAuth every day. So, and that's far beyond the original security threat model for OAuth. So we have highly skilled and highly incentivized attackers nowadays, whereas, of course, your login with Facebook might be interesting to some attackers, but it's not the same as if they get access to your bank account. So that's challenge number 2. And there's another challenge, number 3. Originally, the idea was that OAuth is used in a setup like this. We have one trustworthy client, more or less trustworthy, say. We have one authorization server, and that authorization server gives access to one or several resource servers. That's what you have if you only have Google as the single OAuth provider in the world. That would be the idea. Or if you only have Facebook. So everything would be fine. Nowadays, however, we have a way different picture. It looks more like this. So we have one client that can access multiple authorization servers to get access to multiple resource servers. And this is a big environment. Again, for PSD2, this is like 6,000 authorization servers and probably much more resource servers. And of course, the client didn't register probably manually at each of these authorization servers. Instead, the connections are made in a dynamic way. So if a client goes to an authorization server, this might be the first time that the client sees the authorization server and vice versa. There's no prior registration, so they need to do a registration. There's dynamic client registration, for example. So this is a completely dynamic setup. And of course, some parties of them can also be malicious. If you have such a big ecosystem, if you have a small ecosystem like it's only Google, maybe you say Google is trustworthy. But if you have 6,000 banks, maybe one of them was hacked, was compromised. So this is really a very challenging environment. And then sometimes it turns out that new attacks just arise because you have this dynamic and big ecosystem, like the AS mix-up attack. That's an attack that only arises because you have such an ecosystem. So how can we address these challenges? Well, the IETF started work on a new best practice RFC, a BCP, the OAuth 2.0 security best current practice. It's currently under development of the IETF. I'm one of the co-authors. And in that document, we provide a refined and enhanced security guidelines for OAuth implementers. That does not replace the existing security advice that we have. Especially if you're interested in that topic, you should read RFC 6819, which contains a security threat model for OAuth. We take that and put on top of these all the guidelines that you need to operate OAuth securely in a dynamic and high-stakes environment. It contains an updated and more comprehensive threat model to reflect these environments. We describe a lot of attacks and mitigations. Many of these attacks were not known back when OAuth was standardized. And we provide relatively simple and actionable recommendations on how to protect yourself if you have such an environment. We took input from practice, also from many researchers who came up with the attacks, and we performed a formal analysis of the OAuth protocol to ensure that we hopefully don't overlook any any attacks. I'd like to now present the 5 most important recommendations that the OAuth security BCP gives. Unfortunately, I cannot talk about everything in that BCP because it's really long, and there's a lot of discussions also on each of the recommendations. So you should read that document in any case, but here are the 5 most important things that you should take home if you at some point come in contact with OAuth. The first one is, do not use the OAuth implicit grant any longer. Some have read the blog post by my colleague why you should not use the OAuth implicit grant, and there are many good reasons why you shouldn't do that. Well, it all kind of revolves around the access token, the mighty access token, being available in the web browser. So what can go wrong? Well, if you have an access token in the web browser, it's susceptible to access token leakage via cross-site scripting or misuse via cross-site scripting. It leaks maybe through the browser history. It can leak through proxies. It can leak, especially on mobile operating systems. Sometimes URLs end up in the logs of the operating systems, and this thing is contained in the URL. So the access token really in the browser is in a place where it shouldn't be. And this also goes out to all people who implement single-page applications. So this is really, so the access token can really do a lot of things, and it's not a good thing to have that in the browser. Then you have threats like access token replay. Imagine that you have a resource, so if one authorization server and several resource servers. And one of these resource servers might become compromised, or in a request to one of these resource servers, the access token might leak through some log or something like that. What happens? Well, that resource server, or whoever gained access to the access token, can then reuse that access token at another resource server. That boils down to the access token is not bound to the sender of the access token. So there's no sender constraining for the access token. Ideally, the access token would only be usable to a single sender, and that is the client. And that is not possible in the implicit grant. We will see how that how we can do the same in the authorization code grant in a minute. Then there are threats like access token injection. If you do this pattern, you send the access token to the client, and the client uses that access token. The client cannot be sure where the access token comes from. Of course, if you have proper CSF protection, and the browser is the browser of a user that is benign, then that access token probably comes from that user. If the browser is, however, the browser of an attacker, the attacker can give you any access token, and your application will use that access token. So if the attacker has stolen an access token somewhere else, he will be able to inject that access token into your application, and your application will happily use that access token. Depending on your security requirements, this might be no problem, or it might be a big problem. So the implicit grant sends these powerful and potentially long-lived access tokens through the browser. It lacks features for sender constraining the access tokens. Whoever gets access to the access token can use it, misuse it. And it provides no protection against token replay and injection, and no defense in depth. So if you have cross-site scripting, your access token can be stolen and can be misused. So it's game over. If your URL leaks to an attacker, it's game over. If you have a problem with a redirect URI, and that access token is being sent to an attacker, it's game over. So many, many problems there. Why is implicit even there? So there's the authorization code grant, and as I already hinted, it's more secure than the implicit grant. Why is the implicit there? Well, back 7 years ago when RFC 6749 was designed, there was no cross-origin resource sharing. So there needed to be a way to use OAuth in single-page applications. And, well, the way of doing that would be to send the access token directly to that single-page application. Otherwise, if you send an authorization code to the single-page application cannot do the token exchange and get an access token because there's no cross-origin resource sharing. So there was no way of easily using OAuth with the authorization code grant, so they came up with the implicit grant. But this is no longer needed in 2019. We have cross-origin resource sharing, and you can do the authorization code grant in the browser. Therefore, the first and I think most important recommendation in the security BCP is clients should not use the implicit grant any longer. Clients should instead use the response type code, which boils down to the authorization code grant type. Why is it a should not? Well, some people really love the implicit grant. Some of these people are in the IETF working group, and therefore it's a should not. Yeah. So I would have preferred the must not, but yeah, anyway. Okay, do instead use the authorization code grant. Why? Well, we can put a lot of security features into that authorization code grant, which make it much more secure. And here are some of them. First of them is Pixie, Proof Key for Code Exchange, RFC 7636. That is a cool mechanism that even replaces the cross-site request forgery protection, but it has so many more applications. How does it work? Well, in the authorization request, you send a so-called code challenge. The code challenge is just a SHA-256 hash of some nonce you just came up with. So you pick a random number, you put that SHA-256 of that random number into the authorization request as the code challenge. What happens then? Well, the authorization server remembers that code challenge. The rest proceeds as normal. So there's an authorization code that's sent to the browser. Browser sends code to the client. And then the client wants to exchange that code for an access token. And now the client has to present the so-called code verifier, which is just the plain text of that hash. So just the random number that client picked beforehand. And this means that if somebody steals that code, so if, for example, that code is sent to a third party because you didn't check your redirect URIs properly, then that code cannot be used by anybody who doesn't know the code verifier. And how would you know the code verifier? Well, it's very hard to go back from the SHA-256 hash to the original value. But if you came up with that original value, well, then of course you know that value. So the client, so it's kind of an authentication here. So the client sends the code challenge, and only the client that created that code challenge can then redeem that code for an access token. So that's a super cool mechanism. And if you think about it a bit more, you will see that you don't need any other CSF protection, so you don't need state any longer. Why is that? Well, at a typical CSF scenario, somebody would fake that authorization response. So they would send a code to that client, and that code would be from their own browser or something like that, so from a different session of OAuth, which means that that code will be bound to a different code challenge. So any code that they can come up with will be bound to a different code challenge. That means if you don't put the correct code here, you will not be able to redeem that code. So that's a built-in CSF protection. And the good thing is that this CSF protection is based on the authorization server. So of course, the client can still misuse that. But it's the authorization server who checks the code verifier. And we have seen that oftentimes putting the duties onto the authorization server instead of the client helps with security, because oftentimes the authorization servers are implemented much better than the clients are. So that's Pixie, and Pixie is a must in a new security BCP. There are also other things you can do to protect the code. So of course, code can still be stolen, but you can make code single use. So the access token in the implicit grant, of course, is multi-use. You get the access token, you use it for multiple requests to the resource server. Now you have the authorization code, and that is only used for one single request. And when it's used, you can immediately cancel that code, so nobody else will be able to redeem that code any longer. You can even go a step further, and you can say, if this code is redeemed twice, so once by the benign user and once by an attacker, you can redeem all the access tokens. That means that if an attacker is able to redeem that code before the user is, but the user will still redeem that code because their browser was just not fast enough, then the access token that was illegally sent to the attacker will be worthless to the attacker. So that's single-use code. That's not actually a new thing, but in the security BCP, we stress that you really should use that because it really helps with the authorization code grant security, and it's a thing you can only do, again, in the authorization code grant. You can't do that in implicit. And then, finally, we have sender constraint tokens. With the authorization code grant, we can ensure that this access token can only be used by whoever redeemed that code for the access token. How does it work? Well, there are several mechanisms to do that, but there's a really simple and elegant one, I think. You could use Tls Client Authentication. And I know what you're thinking. Tls Client Authentication is this thing you see in the browser where you have to select a certificate, and it's ugly, and no. We don't want that, and we're not using that. Instead, this is nothing we do in the browser. The client in the backend, so this is a backend request to the authorization server, authenticates itself using a self-signed certificate. So essentially any certificate. That's totally fine. So we don't need PKA to back that up. So use any certificate to send that token request. The AS doesn't check the certificate. It just stores the fingerprint of the certificate. What's happened then is the AS binds that access token to the fingerprint of that certificate. And the idea is that now the access token is bound to the owner of the certificate, which means that the client now, for every use of the access token, also has to present the proper certificate to which the access token was bound. So you bind the access token in the token request, and then it's bound, and for every request you have to present the same certificate. So if somebody steals the access token, for example, if a resource server is compromised, the resource server will not be able to use that access token at another server. Or somebody just reads from some logs the access token or something like that, the access token will be worthless without the certificate or the private key in that certificate. Okay, so we have sender constraining. Again, you can't do that in the implicit grant, because in the implicit grant, the browser is talking, and you don't have the token exchange, so it's much harder to do that. So, authorization code grant with Pixie and MTLS for sender constraining. That protects against token replay, code and token replay and injection. It gives you sender constraining of access tokens, and it really provides defense in depth. So the access token can leak, the code can leak, and still it's not game over. You still have chances to defend against attacks. The recommendation is therefore clients utilizing the authorization grant type must use Pixie, and authorization servers should use TLS-based methods for sender constraining the access tokens. Okay. Some other recommendations that we have in that security BCP, those are not as complicated as the first one that I had here. The second one, stop redirects gone wild. We have, just in the introduction I said, redirections, when they go to the wrong party, they are really a problem. And many of the problems that we see arise from people using regular expressions to match redirections. Well, don't do that. Use exact redirect URI matching. So don't use any patterns, regular expressions, anything like that in your redirect URIs. Use precisely defined redirect URIs. And clients must avoid open redirectors. We have seen that open redirectors, they are not only on the list commonly seen as in general attacks in the web, but they are also especially important for OAuth. So really make sure that your redirectors are not open redirectors on your web page. Number 3, prevent CSF attacks. I briefly talked about that one. CSF attacks must be prevented. So far, the recommendation was to use state. Now we can say if, and that's a big if the authorization server supports Pixie, then you can use Pixie for CSF protection. How do I know whether the authorization server supports Pixie or not? Well, there's OAuth metadata. That's just a JSON document that you can retrieve from the authorization server where it tells you whether it supports Pixie or not. Number 4, limit the privileges of access tokens. Use the sender constraining. I talked about MTLS, mutual TLS or Tls Client Authentication. There are also other methods like HTTP token binding, which is unfortunately essentially dead. And there's also a draft for DPOP, which you could use maybe in single-page applications or if MTLS is not available. You can also do receiver constraining, so ensure that an access token is not valid for many resource servers, but ideally only for the one you want to use. And reduce the scope and lifetime of access tokens. So the scope means what you can do with the access token. If you don't need to delete files from the server, then don't request the permissions to delete files from the server. And reduce the lifetime of access tokens so that they're only valid for, say, a few minutes. And you can use a mechanism in OAuth called refresh tokens, which you, again, can protect a bit better than access tokens. That gives you defense in depth against, so if the access token is leaked and maybe MTLS for some reason fails, then you still have a second line of defense. And finally, number 5, do not use the resource owner password credentials grant any longer. Well, what's the resource owner password credentials grant, you might ask? Well, that works as follows. The user sends a username and password to the client, and the client uses username and password at the authorization server to get an access token. I think I don't have to tell you why that is a bad idea. The client, of course, sees the username and password of the user. This is not what we want today. It's not compatible with two-factor authentication. Don't use that pattern. Thanks. Also, the name is just too long. Okay. Quickly, what else? Again, read the documents. I can't present everything here. What else is on the list? Prevent mix-up attacks. Protect your refresh tokens if you use refresh tokens. Do not use the HTTP status code 307 for redirections, which might be seem a bit strange on that list. Well, it turns out if you use that redirection code, it might cause the attacker to receive the username and password of the user under specific circumstances. Aim to prevent code leakage from referrer headers, from browser history, and so on. There are commonly used practices for that, for example, referrer policies. You can manipulate the browser history to remove URLs from that history, but that's all relatively weak, I would say. So it's easy to overlook things where code might leak, and browser history manipulation was never meant to be a security feature. So try that as a first line of defense, so to say, but yeah, don't rely on it. And use client authentication if possible. Client authentication is optional in OAuth, but if you can do it, do it. It gives more security. Yeah, and after all of that, you might ask yourself, should I even use OAuth? Isn't it just too complicated? I can roll my own thing in 5 minutes and I'm done with it? Well, the answer is you should absolutely use it if it fits your use case. Standards are good. We have interoperability, and we have libraries. Libraries save a lot of time and money, and they contain, hopefully, battle-proven code. So you don't need to make the same mistakes they did. There's a lot of, there are years of experience that went into OAuth, many researchers who analyzed OAuth and OpenID Connect, and there have been dozens of security analysis on OAuth. And this is really something you can profit from, and if you roll your own OAuth or authorization scheme, you are definitely prone to repeat the same mistakes that other people did already, even the most simple ones, because you just don't think of them. Therefore, really do use OAuth, use it properly. It can protect against really strong attackers. That's something we've seen not only in practice, but also in formal analysis. And there are also proofs of that. So it's really something you can rely on if you do it properly. And we are currently working on open banking, so an improvement on open banking security with OAuth, where we really defend against really strong attackers. And that's nothing you can get for free, essentially. So you have to put a lot of work into that. So the bottom line is, do use OAuth, but read the available security advice, including the draft of that document that I'm speaking about. Do implement the latest security features. Not all libraries have them already, but if your library supports it, or if you can select a library that supports them, use that library. Don't roll your own OAuth. Don't roll your own implementations. And of course, know your threat model. Maybe you don't need to defend against all of these attackers. Maybe you need to defend against much stronger attackers. That's it from my side. If you're interested in that document or in that presentation or in all the links, go to my webpage where you'll find that information. You're welcome to speak to me about details on the attacks and mitigations. Many of them I had to skip because of time constraints. Details on the formal analysis, and if you're interested, we are looking for backend Java developers at yes.com. And there are 2 events that I like to promote here. First one is the OAuth security workshop. If you're really into OAuth security, you should go there. And the second one is the security barcamp, which will be in Cologne in April. We had that one time this year, and it was a really cool event, and it's for free, so join us there. We now have 6 minutes and 50 seconds left for questions and answers. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. So, hands up, who got a question to ask? Oh, I can see 2 already. So.
Hey. Du hattest vorhin kurz PSD 2 in den Raum geworfen.
Ja.
Und da gibt es ja irgendwie getrustete Apps, wo ich meine Banking Credentials direkt bei der App eingebe. Wer ist denn auf diese Idee gekommen? Also ich finde, das ist irgendwie ein Rückschritt heutzutage. Warum verwendet man dann nicht OAuth, was ja wirklich ein standardisiertes Protokoll ist?
Ja, richtig. Also diese Frage habe ich mir auch schon manchmal gestellt. Es ist tatsächlich so, dass da so ein bisschen zwei Welten aufeinander gekommen sind. Also zum einen die Web-Security, API-Security-Welt mit OAuth und dem ganzen Zeug und zum anderen natürlich eine Welt, Banking, die schon lange viele Dinge getan haben, auf eine bestimmte Art und Weise und auch nicht gerne die Sachen ändern. Ist halt auch teuer, ne? Ich glaube, so an dieser Schnittstelle sind solche Ideen entstanden.
Also ich finde gerade für Phishing-Attacken ist ja jetzt ja Tür und Tor geöffnet. Also welcher normale, nicht technische Mensch soll denn da noch verstehen, wo er seine Daten eingeben darf und wo nicht?
Absolut. Also das ist absolut ein Problem. Und also wenn es nach mir ginge, gerade diese Flows, wo du halt wirklich das dann da irgendwo eingibst, sollten verschwinden, ja. Also bin ich voll bei dir. Also es ist, also vielleicht für die anderen auch noch, es ist nicht nur ein Problem bei der App der Bank selbst, wo man ja sagen könnte, okay, der vertraue ich irgendwie, aber es ist wirklich, dass Third-Party-Apps dich nach Benutzernamen und Passwort fragen dürfen und dass dann das weitergegeben wird an die Bank. Das kam übrigens auch so ein bisschen aus der Ecke der Leute, die Screenscraping machen. Ne? Also die Sofortüberweisung und so, die ja irgendwie jahrelang Screenscraping gemacht haben, die waren super happy damit, weil das hat dann funktioniert. Uns allen rollen sich die Zehennägel hoch, wenn wir die Idee nur hören, aber so hat es halt funktioniert. Ne? Und denen würde komplett das Geschäftsmodell entfallen. Ich sage nicht, dass das ein valider Grund ist, aber so wäre es halt.
Erstmal danke für deinen schönen Vortrag und meine Frage ist über deine Empfehlungen. Also du hast gesagt oder empfohlen, Refresh-Tokens zu nutzen, vielleicht zusammen mit Access-Tokens. Und so ein Refresh-Token hat eine längere Gültigkeit und könnte als Golden Ticket bezeichnet werden, weil ich dann anhand des Refresh-Tokens, dann Access-Tokens mir wieder antragen kann oder beantragen kann. Und die Frage hier ist, was würdest du hier empfehlen bei Single-Point-Applications? Wie könnte ich so ein Refresh-Token sicher speichern?
Ja. Das ist tatsächlich eine Frage, die derzeit auch in der Community noch diskutiert wird, weil die Empfehlungen für Single-Page-Applications, daran arbeitet die Working Group auch gerade, sind noch nicht fertig. Da gibt es in vielen Bereichen noch keinen genauen Konsens. Persönlich tendiere ich dazu zu sagen, hat deine Single-Page-Application wirklich keinen Server, dem sie im Background? Also es ist echt schwierig, OAuth im Browser sicher zu implementieren. Du bist anfällig und wirst es immer sein für Cross-Site-Scripting und andere Sachen, die ja, wie wir alle wissen, sehr weit verbreitet sind. Wenn du die Sachen auf den Client packst, also auf den Backend-Client packst, kannst du das deutlich besser schützen. Klar hast du dann noch deine Session zwischen Frontend und Backend, aber es fängt schon zum Beispiel damit an, dass du dann das, was dann das Access-Token ersetzt, deine Session-ID, in den am besten geschützten Bereich im Browser machen kannst. Und das ist ein HTTP-only secure Präfix und so weiter Cookie. Das ist immer noch der bestgeschützte Bereich im Browser. Und dann immerhin kannst du deine Session-ID dahin tun und der Client kann nochmal prüfen, ob das, was du da machst, wirklich Sinn macht. Also meine persönliche Empfehlung, aber ich muss auch keine SPAs entwickeln, ist benutzen Backend. Aber wie gesagt, die Diskussionen sind noch nicht vorbei und da wird sicherlich auch noch eine sinnvolle Empfehlung dazu kommen.
Ich glaube, damit beenden wir die Question-and-Answer-Session. Der Daniel ist auf jeden Fall noch erreichbar beim Mittagessen. Könnt ihr ihn gerne ansprechen. Dann machen wir jetzt den Umbau auf den nächsten Talk. Nochmal Hände zusammen für Daniel. Vielen Dank.
Dankeschön.